Hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning and welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Let's get started and jump right into it. As you know, we've been discussing institutions, and this is an interesting conversation because much of the work has been done by economists, but they've been talking a lot about how political institutions really matter a great deal to development or underdevelopment. And the argument, remember, is that the political institutions left behind by colonizers shape the sort of trajectory of development in a country. More democratic or more competitive or open or representative institutions tend to promote development over the long term because they encourage and incentivize investment. On the other hand, more authoritarian institutions tend to inhibit development over the long term because they discourage investment and they discourage competition within markets. Basic logic is that development is a political outcome. And that's a peculiar way of thinking about it, especially for economists, because we typically think about development as economic. But when you consider that institutions create incentives that actors then respond to, it becomes clearer how institutions can create different trajectories of development based upon the incentives that they present the actors with. And so we're going to continue to break down this argument and discuss this today. We'll continue to work with the Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson piece that I assigned for this week, but I'm going to begin sketching some different empirical examples to highlight the different trajectories that countries take based upon the colonization experience that they have. And so we're going to begin in kind of an abstract theoretical way where we sort of summarize and almost put in formal terms the theoretical expectations of this perspective. So the main implication is that development or underdevelopment of a national unit depends on the quality of its political institutions. And really, it depends on the quality of the institutions left behind by colonizers during the period of European colonization. So there's an important emphasis on history and the historical development of countries. We talk about the present day development or underdevelopment of a country based upon its experience with colonization and the institutions left behind by the colonizer. And so we then distinguish between good and bad institutions. And more specifically, we often distinguish, as you'll see, between what have been called settler colonies, where Europeans go and settle themselves and they set up good institutions because they want good institutions where they live. And then extraction or extractive colonies, which are colonies set up by European colonizers that are then ruled from afar. These are places where Europeans don't go and settle necessarily. These are places where the European colonizing states set up institutions and arrangements designed to extract wealth and funnel it back to the mother country. So this historical process that really begins or really kind of takes shape during the period of colonization sets countries off on different paths based upon the types of institutions and really the quality of those institutions, which is how we are distinguishing between them. And so good institutions, what they do is they tend to foster representation, the representation of interests in society. And they also disperse and redistribute power more broadly. And so we're thinking about basic institutions like the right to vote or democratic legislatures, which represent interests that are often organized in parties versus authoritarian dictatorships or absolutist monarchies. These good institutions, which redistribute power and tend to facilitate representation, What they do is they promote investment and exchange because think about it in a kind of basic political way. If the rules of the game politically give leaders an incentive to try to win votes or satisfy a large proportion of the population, they're going to protect and promote the rights of ordinary people. And that in turn is going to encourage investment because of the protection of the right to, for example, own assets or invest in the economy. And it's going to promote exchange and open and competitive markets because those institutions will do all sorts of things like enforce contracts, provide access to credit. They will ensure and guarantee the right or the protection from expropriation or sort of market behaviors that companies might engage in to prey on others, or what we might refer to as predatory takeovers or hostile takeovers. We could talk about any number of practices that good institutions are designed to prevent, right? That are designed to work against so as to provide and encourage participation in the economy and in politics throughout society as opposed to just by elites. We'll talk about what this looks like and get into more detail here in a moment, where I highlight some of the characteristics of good institutions. But bad institutions, on the other hand, are going to do exactly the opposite. They tend to restrict representation to either a narrow elite or a small segment of society that will primarily work in its own interest and not necessarily in the interest of society at large. And these institutions will concentrate power in the hands of a few and in the hands of elites who have no incentive to represent society because they can self-provide, as James Robinson said in the video on Wednesday. The problem with creating institutions that only serve elites is that elites will only serve themselves. They can self-provide, and they will set up a system that doesn't encourage investment in participation in exchange in open and competitive markets, precisely because they don't need to. The logic of this is very neoclassical in the sense that it assumes that actors respond to incentives and that they will use the distribution of power in the institutions available to them to enhance their benefits and impose costs on their foes. And so where you have bad institutions that concentrate power and restrict representation, elites are able to claim economic rents, create an unlevel playing field, or impose losses unfairly on smaller actors. They may prey on other asset holders or engage in hostile takeovers. The idea is that where you have bad institutions, society will be unable to constrain the arbitrary expressions of power of those powerful elites who don't have an incentive to promote investment and exchange in open and competitive markets. And so this is the logic of the argument. Let's talk about what these good institutions do on a more piece-by-piece basis. What these good institutions have in common is that they represent interests. And so in the most common example, you think of the legislature that is elected fairly and democratically, and that has real power to check the executive branch, and that is capable of making decisions and imposing them and creating legislation that everyone in society has to play by the rules of. And this representation of interests takes the form of parties who represent constituencies and districts, and we can set up the institutions in a variety of ways, but the general idea is that good institutions will represent interests relatively effectively. They will also redistribute power. And so all societies have their elites. What sets some societies apart from others is that they are able to set up institutions that restrict and restrain those arbitrary expressions of power by elites or by powerful actors. And so in practice, what this often means is creating check and balance institutions relationships between the executive, the courts, and the legislature that help to balance the powers of those individual branches and prevent any single branch from acting in an undemocratic way or in a way that could potentially disrupt that representation of interests or protection of rights that we consider essential to promoting development and promoting investment in exchange. Good institutions will also mediate conflicts. Why is this the case? Well, people are much more likely to invest and engage in economic activity if they know that they can go to a court to resolve a disagreement, and if that court will do so in an even-handed and fair way, referring to a constitutional framework of some sort that is for the most part objective and is predictable and regular and orderly from the perspective of the actors. Think of it in terms of incentives. Think of it in terms of the incentives that different institutions present actors with. If you don't have check and balance institutions that can stop the executive branch from overstepping its boundaries, expropriation of assets becomes much more likely. If you don't have courts that can stop the executive, expropriation is more likely, as is any number of abuses of power by, say, the departments of the executive branch that would be chiefly involved in something like that. Institutions that are good will also facilitate the enforcement of contracts. When you enter into a contract, you must have faith that the other actor will carry out their end of the deal, but you also need to have some redress of grievances should they not actually carry it out. And so courts in a legal system that are capable of enforcing contracts become especially important. If you don't have courts that are able to do this, and if you don't have institutions that are functional and independent and autonomous and free from, say, the interference of the executive branch, it becomes much more difficult for people to redress grievances in the event that, say, the executive does expropriate or take their assets or abuse power in some way that would be potentially antagonistic to growth or development. It's also the case that good institutions should expand the distribution of assets. So think about rules like anti-monopoly rules, rules and institutions set up to prevent any single company from cornering too much of the market. It's generally accepted that in order to have competitive markets, you need to have some parity in the distribution of assets. This goes to the issue of income inequality and wealth inequality, but also the question of monopolies or breaking up monopolies in large industries. And so there are questions about the rules and the frameworks and the strength of the rules and the frameworks set up to prevent the concentration of assets. What about secure and stable rules? Is there a rule of law that is consistent and that is obeyed? Is there rule of law? If there isn't a rule of law and there's a meaningless sort of quality to the institutions, well, individual economic actors are going to be hurt by that and they'll be dissuaded from investing. They'll be far less likely to go to courts. They'll be far less likely to make the kinds of bold and risky investments that are often necessary to invest large proportions of income in manufacturing, for example. So notice over and over that these are all rules in institutional characteristics or qualities that will dissuade or encourage investment based upon which ones come up. In a similar way, good institutions will limit the arbitrary and disruptive power of the state. And so it's that old classic dilemma. How much power is too much power when it comes to the responsibilities and the capacities of the state? And we need a strong state to protect property rights, but we also need to protect ourselves from the abuse of state power, which can be used to take our assets or potentially interfere in our property rights. We must limit the power of the state at the same time that we create and constitute the power of the state so as to, for example, shore up courts or protect property rights or those institutions that do protect property rights. Good institutions will strike a careful balance between these different considerations. There's also an important role for institutions in fostering and harnessing the intra the independent entrepreneurial spirit of the population. This is an important role for institutions because they must not just provide and protect rights and privileges, but they must also provide for the development of individuals within the system itself. And this is closely related to the availability of capital and access to, for example, credit or human capital in the form of labor or workers, uh, fixed capital in the form of machinery or the components that you would need to set up a factory that would produce certain items and that would contribute to development at a national level and in the aggregate. All of these things fall under good institutions. And notice that these are political institutions, or they are characteristics of political institutions, but they also have a direct impact on the economy because as institutions, they create incentives. And in doing so, they either encourage or they discourage investment in exchange. And so then you can see that there is a role for political institutions. Now, in the same breath, we can also, I'll add one more point, which is that good institutions should also strengthen representation, transparency, and accountability. In the same breath, though, that we can discuss those characteristics of bad institutions and how we would know bad institutions when we saw them. And bad institutions essentially do the opposite of what the good institutions do. And this has to do, for example, with ignoring interests. Bad institutions would, for instance, fail to account for the differences that might exist between the interests of farmers and the owners of farms and the workers on the farms. Bad institutions would be incapable of distinguishing between different interest groups and the different positions of different interest groups. Bad institutions would be incapable of capturing and representing and responding to those interests. And so, in a situation where we have bad institutions, there may be no legislature at all, or it may be very weak, or it may be incapable of exerting control over other institutions of government in a way that would prevent them from potentially abusing state power or abusing the privileges conferred upon the state as the single most important actor. Bad institutions, in a similar way, will concentrate power. They will do so in the hands of the executive, or they will also fail to prevent the buildup of concentrations of power in the economy itself. And so they may have very lax or non-existent rules relating to monopolies or how much of the market or the market share a single company might have. For instance, in some countries, there are natural or legal or intentional monopolies where state companies will control an entire market, say steel or petrochemicals. That's fine. But if you privatize those companies, you need to put in place anti monopoly rules that require the breakup of those shares so that no private actor obtains a market share that is equivalent to a monopoly. But a lot of countries aren't able to put in place those rules. And so, for instance, in Argentina, privatization just resulted in the transfer of entire sectors of the economy to, a narrow slice of private actors. And so there's a concentration of power as a result of very weak, anti-monopoly laws. There's also the potential for the aggravation of conflicts. Bad institutions will not provide actors with ways of resolving disagreements. They will have very weak courts or very weak or weakly established legal codes. They won't have the kinds of legal systems that support and encourage market activity and provide actors with the guarantee or the assurance that they can properly and quickly resolve any disputes that might arise. As a result, actors are far less likely to invest and are far less likely to take risky decisions that might help to promote development in the aggregate. In a similar way, bad institutions will fail to facilitate the enforcement of contracts. Courts are unable or incapable of restraining or reining in the abuses of powerful companies. In some countries in Latin America and in the Middle East, the military is a very powerful economic actor, and they get away with murder, economically speaking. They engage in hostile takeovers. They essentially, seize or expropriate companies, and they very poorly compensate the private actors whom they took the companies from. And how are they able to do this? Well, they're able to do it because they're very powerful. No one can stop them. The courts aren't autonomous or independent enough to check them. And there's no one in the system that can restrain their abuses of power. And any contract that's written up is also largely meaningless in some cases because the military has such influence, and because the courts and the legal system are so weak in the face of the military's advantages in their proximity to the state and the weakness of the private actors in comparison. This is an example of a bad institution. This is a system, a setup that aggravates conflicts, that concentrates power, that ignores interests, that does not enforce contracts, and that restricts the distribution of assets. In these systems that have bad institutions, because of these concentrations of power, the system and the institutions also tend to work against the dispersion or the distribution of assets among larger fields of actors in society. And as a result, you get the concentration of wealth, and you get inequalities that arise over time and really, really grow and become quite large. For all these same reasons, bad institutions are also synonymous with an absence of rule of law or secure and stable rules governing society. These rules are especially important for investors and for those who want to invest in the economy, because they need assurance that over the long term, their investment will generate a return that won't be taken from them, or that won't deteriorate or lose its value because of radical changes in the system. And so there needs to be stable rules that govern the society. They don't want their assets to be taken from them. Without the rule of law, none of this assurance exists, and the security that actors need to make those investments is absent, and as a consequence, those investments won't be made. In these systems that have bad institutions, there is an abundance of arbitrary and disruptive behavior by the state or by elites. The state is often involved in expropriating or taking or overtaxing the assets of actors. Elites themselves might engage in hostile takeovers, like I mentioned with regard to the military. They might poorly or inadequately or not at all compensate those whom they purchase the assets of or they take the assets of. Any number of behaviors are very detrimental to development because they discourage investment, because they create the certainty that if those investments are made, the state or other elites might take them from you or abuse your right to participate in the economy. And then in a similar way, bad institutions will restrict the entrepreneurial capacity of the population for all the same reasons. It might be the case, for example, that there's too much red tape, or it takes, months and months and months to get a certificate to begin a business. Maybe it's the case that you've got to pay inordinate bribes to state officials in order to get the right zoning permit to even set up a small storefront, and so on and so forth. These are examples of rules or characteristics of the system that might prevent entrepreneurship and might make it difficult or outright irrational for individual actors to make investments. And then similarly, bad institutions will make it difficult to obtain credit. They won't readily present available capital to actors, be it economic, human, or social. Money is hard to come by. credit is obtained on very hard or difficult terms, it may not be available at all. In many countries, for example, women cannot access credit. Now, what sense does that make? It makes no sense. That's an example of a rule or an institution that is a bad institution. It does not promote investment. It does not encourage investment. It discourages it, and it outright makes it impossible. These are examples of bad institutions. This is the kind of characteristic that prevents investment in exchange in open and competitive markets. And so all told, these bad institutions, they will weaken representation, and they will weaken transparency and accountability. They will prevent participation in the economy and in politics. And in general, they won't present actors with the incentives to invest and to promote exchange and to make the kinds of investments and decisions that would trigger development over the long term. And the logic of this argument is straightforward. It's that, look, incentives are the result of institutions, and people respond to incentives. In order to get the right incentives, you've got to get the right institutions, and those institutions need to be developmental ones that represent interests, that promote accountability, that redistribute assets, that disperse power, that create opportunities for participation, that advance and promote involvement in the economy, that make capital, credit widely available, and that prevent expropriation and arbitrary expressions of power by the state or by elites. You know, the bad institutions, on the other hand, won't do any of those things, and they will effectively empower those elites in the state and at the expense of investment in exchange. Matt asks, can a country change its institutions, or do they lead to feedback loops that only entrench them further in place? They can change them, absolutely. And we'll see that they can be changed, in that that is political as well. But it's difficult to change them because the beneficiaries of the status quo become more capable of holding it in place with each step in that direction. And they develop a vested interest, and they become powerful enough to uphold those institutions. But there are many examples of countries that have changed them. And there are examples of regions where colonial experience left them with bad institutions, but they were able to basically develop relatively robust democratic histories over the course of centuries, and today are relatively well developed. And we're mainly talking about Latin America. But Latin America is a complex case, because even those cases of well-developed Latin American countries also exhibit some characteristics of bad institutions. And Chile, for example, still has some bad institutions. And there are whole countries in Latin America that remain relatively underdeveloped, and that on the whole would be argued to have bad institutions. And one of the big issues in Latin America is that the quality of democracy is quite weak and quite poor. And in the economy in particular, there's a lot of concentration of power. The rule of law is often weak, and there's a lot of abuse by presidents and by elites in the economy. And as a result, there's a lot of feedback in Latin America, even as they continue to develop new and relatively stable democratic environments and democratic systems. And so there is feedback. There's always a part of the past that stays in the present. And that is why development is not a linear or uniform process, but countries can break the pattern. Rady says, I think it all depends on the type of regime. I don't see a possible change of institutions in an authoritarian regime as long as the institutions serve the regime. Well, that's a good point, Rady. So sometimes authoritarian regimes collapse because the actors inside the regime begin to perceive a transition to democracy to be less costly than the attempt to try to remain in power. And so if it collapses from within, you can very easily get a transition to democracy. If it remains in the interest of the authoritarian elite to stay in power, it's often difficult to break that. But even then, you can still get transitions. And many would say and point out that in Latin America, a lot of those dictatorships were temporary military regimes that were designed to reestablish order and then return to the barracks. Whereas some of the dictatorships in the Middle East, and many of them are absolute monarchies and are more enduring and more durable. And there are differences in the types of dictatorships and the types of authoritarian regimes. But what Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson would say is that it was the experience with colonialism and whether during the colonial period the country was essentially authoritarian or democratic that sets in motion a pattern and a sort of trajectory, if you will, that can be very difficult to break. And so they would argue that even the Latin American democracies today still lag behind precisely because of the pattern set in motion during colonialism, when fragmented societies were ruled by absolute monarchies from afar, chiefly to extract resources and send them to Spain and Portugal. And as a result, Latin America was left with institutions that tended to concentrate power, restrict participation. They didn't represent the various interests of different groups in society. And indeed, you can interpret the political development of Latin America and the concentration of power in the hands of strong presidents as sort of exemplary of this, in a way, this tendency towards bad institutions, where the colonial experience left behind what were essentially bad institutions. And Adolfo says there's also different types of change, and they have their own pros and cons, such as in slow progression versus fast revolution. Yeah, there's incremental change, there's revolutionary change, there's layering. There are varieties of different change, and the ways that institutions change is often tied up with who's changing them and the cause or the circumstances or the context. Matt says, I feel like good institutions can slowly devolve into bad ones, but bad institutions don't just slowly become good ones. Touche. They can begin to break down or falter, especially if they become ossified, and especially if they become sort of inflexible or rigid, and the elites in charge stop responding to changes in society, in the surrounding environment, and stop changing or adjusting the institutions in keeping with those broader changes. That's when you often get devolution or internal kind of collapse. But bad institutions don't just become good ones. So as you'll see in a moment, and as Acemoglu and Robinson would argue, that's true. They don't just become good ones. You need to have a change in power relations first. And I would agree. In my own research, I've tended to find this as well. You only get really big institutional changes where there's a radical change in power relations, and the ones who want change emerge stronger than the ones who are opposed to it. And this has to do with coalition building and the balance of power. And the coalition building process is affected by, other factors. And there's a lot to it, but you'll see in a moment that the question of institutional change does have to do with power. And only when you get those changes in power relations do you get those changes into better institutions. But even changes in power relations don't guarantee better institutions, because you could just replace bad institutions with other bad institutions. But here is an interesting figure that shows us really the relationship between two variables. First, the average protection against the risk of expropriation, and then GDP per capita, or basically purchasing power parity, income per person. And this gives us the relationship between these two for the countries of the world between 1985 and 1995. And as you can see, there's an almost, well, it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's a pretty good line of best fit. It's a pretty clear relationship. As you get more and more protection against expropriation, you get higher per capita income. So the better is the protection against expropriation, the more the economy grows, or the higher the income per person. And this then is just a way to sort of present a basic relationship that captures a lot of what I just discussed, that tendency for the different types of institutions to present actors with different incentives, and for those different incentives to shape the development trajectory over the long term. And so I ask you a question here. Protection against risk of expropriation is the independent variable, and income per capita or income per person is the dependent variable. And I want to ask you, why is protection against risk of expropriation a good indicator of the quality of political institutions? What does that tell us about the quality of political institutions that makes it a good indicator? So Rady says it ensures that political institutions won't take over the economy. So like what kinds of institutions? Definitely. Which ones? Rady says instead it will create incentives for private ownership. Absolutely. And that's a sound interpretation. When we say that it ensures that political institutions won't take over the economy, which political institution are we primarily thinking about?
I wouldn't say like exactly political institutions, but I will be thinking more of political personalities, like say like people in power that control the government and will have like enough power to, let's say, create some kind of law or something that will give permission of ownership for the government. So like, let's say, expropriate properties and stuff.
Good, Rady. Yeah, so there's a whole explanation there that's really on point. When we talk about expropriation, as Max points out here in the chat, we're talking about the state, right? We're talking about the power of the state to take your assets, not like your car or your house, maybe, but primarily like a factory or your productive investments, right? Your fixed capital. When the state expropriates assets, it goes and it literally just takes that stuff from people, from companies, and it absorbs them, or it nationalizes the companies, and it does what it wants with it. And that process is always a legal and a political process. There's always the creation of a law, or at least there's the the decreeing of a law that says that this will be nationalized or that this will be taken. They church it up as much as they can, but it's expropriation. It's the seizure of privately owned assets by the state. So we're mainly looking at the state and those institutions of the state that would be involved in that. And that means that we're looking at what the government is doing in the rules and the laws that are made, regarding what the state will take and what it will not. And so what we're looking at here is we're looking at, well, what is the relationship between protection against expropriation and overall economic growth? And what we find is that in those places where the state was the least likely to expropriate assets, the growth rates were the very highest. And as Rady points out, the explanation is that the growth rates were the highest in those places because people had an incentive to invest. They knew that their assets would not be taken from them by the state. And so they could be confident that if they invested and if they put money in the economy and bought and expanded production, that their assets would not be taken. And when they went forward and made those choices, the economies grew. On the other hand, in those places like Haiti and Sudan, Malawi, I believe, maybe I'm mistaken, the risk of expropriation was much higher. There was much lower levels of protection against expropriation. It meant that it was far more likely that the state would come and take your factory or take your assets. And in those places, growth rates were the lowest. And the explanation is that in these places, people had a very clear incentive to not make those investments because they knew that if they did, it was very likely, or it was more likely that those investments would be taken from them by the state. And so this gets then to that question of the quality of political institutions and the extent of property rights, the extent to which the power of the state is restrained and restricted, the extent to which institutions are set up to encourage and promote individual initiative, protected from the excesses of the state. Matt says, so an independent and strong court system would be valuable to prevent the executive branch of the government from expropriating. Absolutely. Yes. Because if you're an economic actor, who do you go to resolve a dispute that you cannot resolve privately with a business partner or someone you're engaged in some transaction with? You go to the courts, right? And you ask them to resolve it, and you ask them to do so fairly and judiciously and carefully and orderly. But if the courts are not independent, and if they're basically under the control of the executive branch, well, then you lose an important function, and you lose an important institution that then results in the incentive to not invest, because investors can't rely on the courts anymore to protect them from the state. And so courts become important. Access to credit and finance at favorable, stable terms becomes important. Um, Rules and arrangements set up to prevent arbitrary expressions of power by the executive, important. Check and balance institutions, important. Property rights, important. These things matter a great deal because people are rational. They are calculating and they respond to incentives. And those of you who've taken an economics class, this may have been the first thing that you ever learned. I remember it was like the first thing that they ever told us. People respond to incentives. And they do. If you give them an incentive to invest, they will. If you take away an incentive to invest, they won't. Or at the very least, they will, but you'll expropriate their assets, and the state may be less dynamic and less inventive in possession of those assets than the private sector would, which would also result in a slowdown in development or growth of a similar kind. But you can see then that there's a clear relationship between these kinds of factors. So now that we have an understanding of these types of institutions and how they impact development, and now that we know what characteristics are indicative of good and bad institutions, we're going to consider the different trajectories that the colonial world took and the different places in the colonial world took. And those trajectories are settler colonies or extraction colonies. And in Latin America, the European powers largely set up what we referred to as extractive states. And these were authoritarian, absolutist states that were intended to solidify control and facilitate the extraction of resources. These were states that lacked almost completely the kinds of good institutions or the characteristics of good institutions that we just discussed. Instead, Latin American countries, or present day Latin American countries, were left with extractive institutions, or with bad or predatory institutions. And these institutions were set up primarily to facilitate the extraction of precious minerals and the accumulation of resource wealth in the hands of the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns. Both of those colonizers essentially pursued the same agenda in Latin America, and they did so largely because the Latin American colonies were in many cases full of precious natural resources and minerals like silver and gold. And they often also had very extensive and sophisticated indigenous societies with institutions and social stratification systems that could be harnessed uh, for the purpose of mining those natural resources and channeling the revenue back to Spain or Portugal. So Latin America then presents us with a very clear example of an extractive state or a set of extractive states. And we're not thinking of Latin America as a whole, but we're thinking of as Latin America as a series of different national units. And we're thinking in the terms of the present day national units that we're familiar with. So we'll be talking a lot about the countries as we know them today. But going back to that colonial period and going back to those institutions that were set up during that critical moment in time, that formative moment that James Robinson talks about as sort of the moment when the natural experiment became a reality, or the pseudo natural experiment became a reality. In Latin America, the European powers, they did not set up democratic frameworks. They set up absolutist states that were rigidly controlled from the top down, and that very, very, very carefully set up relationships of control between the center and the colonies themselves. And they used what were essentially quasi-feudal political institutions to do this. And these were set up to answer to the crown and to duplicate the authoritarian institutions that were in place in Spain and in Portugal itself at the time. And so what this meant was that there was no legislative component. There was no representation of interests. There was no assembly or channel for the articulation and formation and representation of the different interests in society. There was no set of mechanisms for relationships of accountability between different institutions. Those did not exist. These were absolute states that lacked a democratic framework of any kind. And not only that, there was also a clear stifling sort of social uh, control exercised by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church did not allow for dissenting views, did not tolerate dissenting views. And what's more, the Catholic Church even collaborated with the crown, the Spanish and the Portuguese crown, to consolidate control and to sort of tighten and consolidate these quasi-feudal political institutions that help to reproduce rigid top-down control. And so the main way that Spain and Portugal did this was through these political institutions that began with the viceroyalty. And the viceroyalty was basically like a mini crown. These were essentially domains of the colonial world that corresponded to individual viceroys that were created and functioned as vice kings. Basically, they basically duplicated the authority of the king or the crown, and in doing so they ruled over vast areas of South America. These areas were themselves viceroyalties or viceroyalties ruled over by viceroys. And this political institution was the sort of pinnacle of the extractive state, in that it created that top-down hierarchical undemocratic form that helped to consolidate that rigid control of the political system and the economy. Needless to say, this was not a democratic setup whatsoever. It was not at all an open or democratic or inclusive setup. It was the outlines of a predatory extractive state. Listen, everybody, we don't have the time to finish this lecture today, so we'll finish on Monday and we'll begin our new unit next week as well. But thank you for being here today, and I'll see you next time. Have a nice weekend.